The air in the room was still, thick with the scent of roses that Celine's mother had carefully arranged on the table. Soft petals, white against the gold of the old chandelier above. The light was low, the afternoon sun fatting behind heavy curtains. It was a quiet kind of beauty, the kind that made everything seem perfectly in place. Celine sat by the window, watching the world outside, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her thoughts drifted with the passing breeze, but they always returned to the same thing. Vincent. Her mother's voice broke the silence, soft but insistent. "You'll marry him, Celine. You know this is for the best." She didn't look at her mother, but she could feel the weight of her words settling over her like a blanket too heavy to lift. The house was too quiet these days. It had always been quiet, but now it felt hollow. Each day blurred into the next, each hour marked by the endless ticking of the clock in the hall. The noise of her family's struggles, the unspoken tension, the constant whisper of wanting something more, it had all led to this moment. Celine's mother wasn't a cruel woman. She had worked tirelessly all her life, sacrificed so much for her family. But there was something cold in her now, a calculation that Celine had never seen before. She spoke in that gentle, but firm, way as if she had already decided for Celine what was best for her. "You'll never have a chance like this again, my dear." Her mother's words were careful, as though she were speaking to a child. "Vincent's business will provide for us all. We'll never have to worry again. All you have to do is accept his offer." Celine's eyes remained on the window, the world outside moving slowly, almost as if it were watching her too. She could hear her mother moving around behind her, the faint rustling of fabric, the soft clink of her jewelry as she adjusted it. She could feel her mother's presence, warm and heavy, pressing in on her. She didn't want to feel this way. She didn't want to feel trapped, but she did. The promise of money, of a life without struggle, was too great to ignore. It was the life her mother had dreamed of for so long, a dream Celine hadn't asked for but would now inherit. "I know you don't like it," her mother continued, her voice softer now. "But think of what it will mean, for the family, for you, this is what's best." Celine closed her eyes. Her mother's words were so final, so resolute. It felt like there was no room for anything else, no space for doubt. She had been raised to believe in duty, in obligation. Her family's well-being had always come first, above her own desires, above her own happiness. And this was her duty. This was the way out. But as the days passed, as the wedding drew closer, Celine couldn't shake the sense of dread that coiled tightly in her chest. She had convinced herself that this was the only way out. She had convinced herself that this was the only way to make everything better, to erase the years of struggle. But the dread didn't fade, it only grew. The day came, the day she would meet Vincent for the first time. She stood before the mirror, adjusting her dress, smoothing down the fabric. The reflection staring back at her felt foreign, as though she were wearing someone else's skin. The woman in the mirror wasn't Celine. She wasn't the girl who dreamed of something else. She was someone else, someone defined by the weight of expectation. Her mother was already waiting for her downstairs, dressed in a fine gown, the gold jewelry catching the low light. Her smile was tight, as if this was the moment she had been waiting for, and Celine's heart sank further into the pit of her stomach. The meeting was to be brief, formal. Vincent was an elderly man, a successful businessman with a fortune to offer, but his health was rumored to be fatting. She had heard whispers, but it didn't matter. Not anymore. Her mother had already made up her mind. The contract was as good as signed. When Vincent arrived, he entered the room with the air of someone accustomed to having his presence felt. He was tall, his face lined with years of success and hidden struggles. He didn't smile. His greeting was cool, formal. His hand was dry when it met hers. The touch was brief, barely more than a handshake, but it lingered in her mind long after. His eyes were sharp, cold. They swept over her with a calculated interest, but there was nothing warm in them. She had been told he was ill, but she hadn't expected it to feel so. Palpable, the frailty of his body, the sharpness of his gaze. He didn't have much time left, but he still held power, still held control over the room. "Miss Celine," Vincent said, his voice steady, with a low, rumbling quality. "I trust we're in agreement." Celine nodded, her throat tight, her hands cold in her lap. The conversation was brief, but in that silence, something in her stirred. The promises her mother had made felt too large to ignore, but the reality of this agreement, this choice, sat heavy on her chest. She wasn't marrying Vincent because she loved him. She wasn't marrying him because she felt any connection to him. She was marrying him because it was expected, because it was the only way to change everything. As they spoke, the words became distant. The formalities, the promises of wealth, of security, they were just words. They didn't touch her, didn't reach her. The weight of the marriage loomed closer, and with each passing second, she realized that this choice, the one she had made, was not a choice at all. It was an obligation, a sacrifice. That night, Celine stood by the window again, the world outside dimmed by the evening fog. Her mother's voice echoed in her ears, her words about duty, about what was best for the family. She had said yes, hadn't she? She had agreed to the arrangement, to the future her mother had dreamed of. But as she stared out into the fog, the promise of money, of a life without struggle, began to feel hollow. She wondered what kind of man Vincent truly was. She wondered what kind of life awaited her on the other side of this decision. Would she be happy, or would she simply be free of struggle? She didn't know, but as the days marched toward the wedding, one thing became clear. This decision, this marriage, would change everything. And no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, a small part of her wondered if she was trading her own future for something far less than she deserved. The choice had been made, but the future still felt uncertain. And with that uncertainty came the quiet realization that what she wanted, what she truly wanted, had been left behind somewhere in the fog. The car slowed to a stop at the foot of a long, winding driveway. Celine stared through the rain-smeared window, her breath fogging the glass. Vincent's estate loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the stormy evening sky, an imposing mansion that seemed to swallow up the surrounding landscape. Its high windows were black, unlit, and the stone walls felt cold even from where she sat. The house was like something from a forgotten time, grand, but without warmth, without life. The driver opened the door for her, and Celine stepped out into the damp night, the cool air biting at her skin. Her feet crunched on the gravel as she walked toward the front door, the sound of the stones beneath her heels louder than anything else. There was no welcoming light, no warmth spilling from the windows, only the echo of her own footsteps, as if the house itself was waiting, watching. The door opened slowly, a tall man in a dark suit standing in the frame. His face was impassive, and he gave her no more than a polite nod as he ushered her inside. The door closed behind her with a soft, almost final thud. The entry hall was vast, the ceiling stretching high above her, and Celine's voice seemed to disappear the moment she spoke. There was no sound here, just a deep, heavy silence. The air smelled faintly of wood and dust, like the house had been locked up for far too long. The walls were lined with dark portraits, faces frozen in time, watching her as she walked past them. "Mr. Vincent is in the study," the servant said, his voice soft but clipped. "He is expecting you." Celine nodded, her throat tight. She had never been inside a house so large, so quiet. It felt as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something, for her to speak, perhaps, for her to make her presence known. But she didn't know what to say, she didn't know how to fill the silence. The servant led her through a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly, and Celine's footsteps echoed in the hollow space. Every door they passed was shut, every room closed off. She felt like she was walking deeper into a maze, deeper into something she couldn't escape. When they reached the study, the servant opened the door without knocking. Inside, Vincent was sitting behind a large desk, his posture stiff, his face expressionless. His hands rested on the desk, the fingers slightly curled as if he was waiting for something, waiting for her. "Miss Celine," he said, his voice low and measured but distant. He didn't stand to greet her, and Celine hesitated before stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn shut against the night, casting everything in shadow. There was a coldness in the air, like the room had been closed off from the world for too long. "Vincent," she said, her voice quiet, unsure. She didn't know how to speak to him. There had been so little between them, so little conversation, so little connection. She had agreed to marry him, but in the few moments they had spent together, she felt like a stranger in his presence. He nodded but said nothing. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, cold and searching, before he gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, the distance between them feeling unbearable. They sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Celine could feel the weight of the quiet pressing down on her, and the longer it stretched, the more it seemed to fill the room. She could hear the faint sound of the rain tapping against the windows, the occasional creak of the house settling, but Vincent's stillness was louder than anything. Finally, he spoke again, but it wasn't about anything important. "I trust the journey was comfortable." "Yes," Celine replied, her voice soft. It felt strange, these words between them. They weren't words that bridged a gap. They only deepened it. "Good," Vincent said, his eyes flicking to the glass of wine on his desk. His hands were trembling slightly as he reached for it, the movement almost imperceptible, but Celine saw it. His fingers shook just enough for her to notice. He was trying to hide it, but it was there. He raised the glass to his lips, his eyes not meeting hers as he took a slow sip. The hand holding the wine seemed tense, the grip too tight, the knuckles pale beneath the surface. Celine watched him closely, her own unease growing. The man she was about to marry seemed so distant, so controlled, yet there was something about him that unsettled her. He wasn't the man she had imagined, the powerful, confident businessman her mother had told her about. He was an enigma. There was a coldness about him, a wall she couldn't break through, and his silence felt like it was holding something back. She watched his hands carefully, wondering if he was hiding something more than his trembling. But before she could ask, Vincent set the glass down on the table with a soft click, the sound cutting through the silence between them. "I hope you understand the gravity of this decision," he said, his voice calm but distant, his eyes finally meeting hers. "This marriage, it's not just a union of two people. It's the joining of two lives, two families." Celine nodded, though she didn't know if she agreed. She was here for the money, for the security it would provide her family. But that wasn't something she could say aloud, not now, not in the cold, empty silence of this house. "I understand," she said, her voice soft but firm. She didn't know if she truly understood, but she had to say it. She had to convince herself that this was the right choice. Vincent didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, his eyes calculating, his face unreadable. The silence between them grew again, thicker this time, as if the room itself was closing in on them. And then, without warning, he stood, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked toward the window, his back to her as he gazed out into the rain. "I am not the man you think I am, Celine," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But I will be what you need me to be, and I will keep my promises." The words were cryptic, and Celine didn't know what to make of them. Was he warning her, or was it just another moment of his cold, distant nature? She couldn't tell. "I believe you," she whispered, though a part of her wasn't sure she did. Vincent turned back to face her, his gaze steady. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will be married. It is a formality, but it is the beginning of everything." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. It was all happening too quickly. The wedding, the promises, the future, it was all closing in around her, and she didn't know how to escape it. But she knew one thing for sure. Something was hidden beneath his cold exterior. Something that she couldn't yet see, but she could feel. And as she left the room, the silence following her like a shadow, she couldn't help but wonder what he was really hiding. What kind of man would Vincent turn out to be? The morning of the wedding was silent, the kind of silence that settles deep in your bones. The house was buzzing with activity, but it felt distant, like everything was happening around Celine, not to her. She sat in front of the mirror, her reflection almost unrecognizable. The dress was magnificent, delicate lace, satin that shimmered in the soft light, the long train flowing behind her like something out of a dream. But it didn't feel like her dress. It felt like someone else. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the lace veil, smoothing it over her face. The weight of the diamonds around her neck, the silk gloves on her arms, only made the hollowness inside her more noticeable. This was not the life she had imagined. This was a life she had been handed, dressed up in gold and luxury, but it was still not hers. Not really. She heard footsteps behind her, and Maria entered the room, her face still calm, but her eyes tired, as if the weight of the day had already begun to sink into her. "You look beautiful, Celine," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but her smile was tight, forced. "Thank you, Mama," Celine replied softly, her voice catching in her throat. She wanted to say something more, to ask her mother what she thought of this whole thing, but there was no space for that. No room for words that might make this real. Maria's hands trembled as she reached out to adjust the veil, her fingers brushing the fabric like it was something fragile. "This is what's best for us," she said, her voice softer now. "For the family." Celine didn't respond. What could she say? The ceremony was already set. The promises were already made. She didn't have the luxury of doubt anymore. The ceremony was brief. Too brief. The grand hall was filled with people she didn't know, faces she couldn't name. The air was thick with tension, with the heavy weight of expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Vincent stood at the altar, his eyes steady, his face almost unreadable. He was tall, commanding, the sharp cut of his suit making him look more like a figure from a painting than a man she would marry. As they exchanged vows, Celine's voice caught in her throat, and she wondered briefly if this was how it always felt to give yourself away. She repeated the words, her mouth dry, trying to ignore the way Vincent's eyes never left her. His gaze was sharp, almost calculating, and yet it was distant. She couldn't figure out what he was thinking, couldn't understand what he was seeing when he looked at her. The priest spoke quickly, his words echoing through the hall, but they didn't feel real. It was all too fast, too clean, too perfect. And then it was done. Vincent took her hand, his grip firm, and for a moment, Celine wondered if she could slip away, disappear into the crowd of strangers, but she didn't. She couldn't. The reception was no different. The room was large, filled with expensive flowers and crystal chandeliers, but Celine didn't notice the beauty of it. She felt like an outsider in her own life, watching it unfold without really being a part of it. She sat at the long table, surrounded by guests whose names she had forgotten before they even introduced themselves. The clink of silverware against plates, the murmur of polite conversation, felt distant, like she was watching it all unfold from a dream she couldn't wake from. Vincent sat beside her, but there was an invisible barrier between them. He didn't speak much, just observed. His eyes never left her, as if he were studying her, waiting for something, but she didn't know what. Every time their gazes met, her stomach tightened. His silence was unnerving, more so than any words could have been. He lifted his glass, the wine swirling in the glass before he took a slow sip. He didn't offer her a drink, didn't say anything, just watched her, his eyes cold, as if trying to decipher something he didn't understand. The silence between them stretched long. She could feel his gaze on her, piercing, but he didn't speak. Celine picked at her food, the delicate bite of the fish, the soft roll, but nothing tasted right. The food was too rich, too heavy for her stomach, but she ate anyway, trying to fill the space between them with something other than the quiet. "You don't talk much," she said, her voice sounding strange in the silence, but it was all she could think to say. Vincent looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into something like a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I find it more useful to watch," he said softly, his voice low, almost too quiet for her to hear. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She swallowed, unsure of how to respond, her heart beating faster now. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled her, it was the way he watched her, the way his eyes never left her, like he was waiting for something to happen. But what? What was he waiting for? The evening continued, but Celine felt like she was drifting through it. The distant hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the soft laughter from the corners of the room, it all felt muffled, like she was underwater. She glanced over at Vincent again, his face still unreadable, his hands steady on his wine glass. She wondered for a moment if this was how it always was, how it always felt, to marry someone you didn't know. To step into a life that didn't belong to you, but had been given to you, like a contract you couldn't refuse. Vincent's hand reached for the wine again, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. It was subtle, the way his hand shook, but Celine noticed it, just like she noticed everything about him, the way his eyes never softened, the way he barely spoke, the way the distance between them stretched further with every passing moment. "Are you okay?" Celine asked softly, her voice betraying the unease in her chest. She hadn't meant to speak, hadn't meant to ask, but the question slipped out before she could stop it. Vincent set the glass down gently, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like hours. For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze held hers, but there was no warmth in it, no comfort, just cold observation. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat. "This is just business." Celine nodded, her heart sinking further into the pit of her stomach. This was just business. And that's all it would ever be. The night stretched on, and the laughter around her faded into the background. Celine sat there, her back stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wondered how long she could keep pretending that this was what she wanted, that this was all she needed. Vincent's presence beside her felt like a wall she couldn't breach. He had given her the world, but it wasn't the world she wanted. And she wasn't sure what would happen next. Would he stay distant, watching her from the edges of their marriage, waiting for something she couldn't give? Or was there more to him, more to this strange, uncomfortable silence? Celine didn't know, but as the night wore on, one thing became clear. Vincent wasn't the man she had imagined, and the life she had agreed to wasn't the one she had hoped for. She couldn't escape it now. This was her life, and the only question that remained was whether she could ever make it her own. The days blurred together after the wedding, each one slipping by with a quiet urgency that Celine couldn't quite place. The house was vast, too vast. Each room felt colder than the last, each hallway more unfamiliar. But still, she moved through it all, trying to fit herself into the rhythm of her new life, a life she hadn't chosen but now had no choice but to accept. Vincent remained an enigma. He was always there but never truly present. He was distant, his demeanor cold and formal, as if he had never been taught to understand warmth. He rarely left the house, and when he did, he cloaked himself in a heavy, dark coat that seemed out of place for the mild weather. His steps were quick, purposeful, and whenever he returned, he never spoke of where he had been, his eyes shadowed with something Celine couldn't decipher. His habits grew stranger with each passing day. He would disappear for hours, leaving the house in a silence that felt heavier than usual. At dinner, his food was always untouched, as though he had already eaten, though Celine had never seen him take a meal. The only time he spoke was to offer clipped responses when spoken to, his voice cold, almost mechanical. And the most unsettling part was that he never once mentioned his absences. One evening, after dinner, Celine sat in the drawing room, her fingers tracing the edge of a book. She had tried to settle into the house, but it never felt like hers. There were moments when the air seemed thick, suffocating. She couldn't ignore the fact that something was off about Vincent, something beyond his aloofness, beyond his coldness. It was as though he were hiding something from her, hiding something from everyone. The house was still, and she could hear his footsteps upstairs. Her heart beat faster. Tonight, she would follow him. Tonight, she would uncover what he was hiding. The clock ticked slowly, and Celine stood, her heart pounding in her chest as she moved toward the hallway. She stepped lightly, her soft footsteps muffled by the carpet. The house was silent around her, the only sound the distant rustle of the wind outside, brushing against the windows like an unwelcome guest. She moved toward the library, a place she had never explored fully. It had always felt off-limits, like one of those places in the house where nothing was meant to be found. She reached the door to the library and paused, taking a deep breath before quietly turning the handle. The door creaked open, just enough to slip through. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the wooden shelves that lined the walls. The air was thick with the smell of old books and dust, a scent that seemed to come from another time. Celine moved carefully through the room, her fingers brushing along the spines of the books. The silence in the room was different here, somehow more welcoming, but also more oppressive. She had never been allowed to spend much time in this room. Vincent had always been quick to close it off when he was finished with whatever business he was dealing with. And now here she was, searching. Her eyes scanned the shelves, landing on various books about medicine, psychology, and even a few that looked like old journals. She pulled one from the shelf and opened it, her fingers tracing the delicate pages as she read the faded text. Most of it was dense and technical, the sort of thing she had never really cared to learn about, but something in her stirred. Something about the way Vincent's mind worked. She couldn't stop herself from wanting to know what he was hiding. As she moved deeper into the library, she found more books that caught her eye. Titles about masks, about the psychology of identity, about human behavior. Her heart rate quickened as she flipped through the pages of one particular book. It seemed to be a study on the art of disguise, on the way people could alter their appearance and behavior to deceive others. The air around her felt heavier now, like the walls were closing in. Vincent's strange habits were beginning to make more sense, but they only raised more questions. Why would he have all these books about masks, about changing oneself? What was he hiding? And why had he gone to such lengths to keep it from her? As she pondered, a sudden sound made her freeze, the soft creak of a floorboard. Vincent was at the door. Her heart raced, and before she could react, the door opened. Vincent stood there, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching her. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark, but there was something about them, something sharp, almost predatory, like he had been expecting her all along. Celine's breath caught in her throat. I was just looking, she said, her voice shaky, though she didn't know why she felt so guilty. Vincent didn't respond at first. He just stepped into the room, his gaze flicking over the books she had pulled from the shelves. He didn't move toward her, didn't make any move to confront her, but Celine could feel the weight of his presence. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. He stepped closer to the bookshelf, his eyes still fixed on the titles. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You shouldn't be in here," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving the books. "There are things you don't need to know." Celine's pulse quickened, but she didn't back away. She stood her ground, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the book she had been reading. "Why do you hide them, Vincent?" Her voice was quiet, but the question felt loud in the stillness. "What are you hiding from me?" Vincent turned toward her, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes now, something cold and calculated. "You don't need to know everything, Celine," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Some things are better left unseen." But Celine didn't back down. She was no longer afraid. She had spent too long being pushed aside, being controlled by the unknown. She needed to know. "Why do you wear that cloak?" she asked, her voice steady now, a defiance rising in her chest. "Where do you go when you leave?" Vincent's eyes flicked to the door, to the dark hallway beyond, and for a moment, Celine thought he might answer her. But he didn't. Instead, he turned away, his gaze flicking back to the books. "You've seen enough for one night." Celine stood still, her heart pounding in her chest as he walked past her, his footsteps heavy, but his presence still looming in the room. She didn't know what to make of this encounter, but something inside her had shifted. The questions were only growing now. What was Vincent hiding? And why did he feel the need to keep it all from her? As he left the room without another word, the door clicking shut behind him, Celine felt the tension in the air tighten once again. The library, once full of intrigue, now felt oppressive, like a prison. She couldn't unsee what she had found. And she couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more to Vincent than she had ever imagined. What was he hiding? And what did it mean for the life she had just married into? The answer seemed just out of reach, like a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she would find out. She had to. The clock ticked slowly in the quiet of the sitting room. Celine sat in the armchair, the flickering light from the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. The warmth of the room did little to ease the chill creeping up her spine. She had been waiting for Vincent for hours, though it felt like a lifetime. The house was silent, the kind of silence that grew heavier the longer it stretched. The smell of dinner lingered in the air, but she had barely eaten. Her mind was too full, too consumed with the things she had seen in the library, the questions that Vincent had yet to answer. She had thought she knew what kind of man he was, but now she wasn't so sure. His strange behavior, the books, the cloak he wore when he left, it all felt like a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve. But Celine couldn't stop herself. She had to understand. The front door creaked open, and Vincent's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Celine sat up straighter, her heart thudding in her chest. When he entered the sitting room, the expression on his face was unlike any she had seen before. He was tense, his movements stiff, his eyes shadowed with something darker than usual. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, his coat still on, his gaze distant, like he was trying to push something away. And then he held out his hands. In them was a mask. It was the same mask he had worn during their wedding, intricate, delicate, its features crafted from fine materials that caught the light in strange ways. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. Something off. The smooth surface of the mask gleamed in his hands, but it seemed to hide more than it revealed. Celine's breath caught in her throat. "Vincent," her voice faltered, the name a whisper she wasn't sure she should speak. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the mask, and there was something in his gaze that made her uneasy. "It's time," he said, his voice low, almost strained. "Time for you to understand. Time for you to see." Celine stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She didn't know what he meant, but she could feel the shift in the air. The tension between them was thick now, a force she couldn't ignore. He wasn't the man she had married, not anymore. "What do you want me to see?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Vincent stepped toward her, the mask still held out in front of him. He looked at her then, his eyes soft, almost desperate. There was a vulnerability in them she had never seen before. "You need to prepare yourself," he said quietly. "I've been keeping things from you, things I should have told you long ago. But there's still time. You need to understand what you've married into, what this life really is." Celine took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the mask on the table in front of her, his hands lingering for a moment before pulling away. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in as if the very air was holding its breath. "Meet me in the study after dinner," Vincent said, his voice quieter now, almost broken. "There are things I need to show you, things you won't understand until you see them." Celine stared at him, trying to make sense of the strange words, the strange man standing before her. The mask, the same mask he had worn during the wedding, seemed to hold all the answers. But the question that burned in her mind was, why now? Why had he waited until this moment, until this night, to tell her what he had been hiding? She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? What could she ask? Vincent turned away, his footsteps heavy as he walked toward the door. But before he left, he looked back at her, his eyes searching hers. "I know you're scared," he said softly, as though he could feel the weight of her fear in the silence between them. "But I need you to trust me. I need you to see what's behind the mask." And with that, he was gone. Celine stood there, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. The mask on the table seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, beckoning her to understand, to see the truth that Vincent had been hiding. She walked toward the table slowly, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the mask. It felt cold, too cold, as though it had never been worn, as though it was waiting for her to take it. But she didn't, not yet. The room felt suffocating, the silence too loud. Her mind raced with questions she didn't have answers to. What had Vincent been hiding all these years? What had he been keeping from her? And why had he waited until now to tell her the truth? Dinner was served shortly after Vincent left, but Celine barely touched her food. The room was silent once again, the air heavy with the promise of what was to come. She couldn't stop thinking about the study, about what she might find there. What was Vincent hiding? What was behind the mask? The house felt different now. The shadows seemed darker, the silence deeper. The questions that had been lingering in her mind now felt like an insistent echo, impossible to ignore. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second drawing her closer to the study, to whatever Vincent was waiting to reveal. She could feel the weight of his absence, the tension that filled every space he wasn't in. The mask still sat on the table, a symbol of the mystery, the secrets, the life she had married into. Celine stood, her hands trembling as she moved toward the door. She didn't know what awaited her in the study, but she knew she had to go. The questions inside her couldn't wait any longer. The truth, whatever it was, had to be uncovered. With a final glance at the mask, she left the room. The weight of the house settled on her shoulders as she walked down the hallway, the dim light casting long shadows at her feet. The path to the study seemed endless, but it was the only path left to take. She didn't know what was waiting for her, but she was ready to face it. Because whatever it was, she couldn't ignore it any longer. The door to the study creaked open, and Celine stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of old books and dust. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single lamp on the desk where Vincent sat. His figure was hunched, his hands gripping the mask, the same one he had worn on their wedding day. It lay on his lap, the intricate design glinting faintly in the dim light. Celine's heart pounded in her chest as she approached him, each step echoing in the quiet of the room. Vincent didn't look up at first. He didn't even move when she entered. There was a stillness about him, an eerie calm that made the tension in the air feel suffocating. He shifted slightly, his hands tightening around the mask, the fragile porcelain gleaming in his grip. He didn't speak at first, but the silence between them was loaded, thick with unspoken words, with secrets that had been buried for too long. Finally, he lifted his gaze to hers. His eyes were dark, sunken, and for the first time, Celine saw how pale his face had become. There was a gauntness to his features, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. He looked older, frailer, his presence more hollow than it had ever been. "Celine," he said softly, his voice almost too quiet, like he was speaking from a great distance. "You've finally come." There was something about his tone, something softer than the man she had married. But it didn't comfort her. Instead, it made the knot in her stomach tighten, the dread growing heavier. Vincent placed the mask down gently on the desk, his fingers lingering over it, as if the mask was a lifeline he wasn't ready to let go of. "There's something you need to understand," he continued, his voice lower now, almost strained. "I haven't been honest with you, about who I am, about why I sought you out." Celine swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to ask, to demand the answers she had been waiting for, but she didn't know where to start. She just stood there, waiting, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Vincent shifted in his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the glass of water on the desk. He took a long sip before setting it back down with a soft clink. "I'm ill, Celine," he said finally, the words coming out with an unsettling finality. "No one knows, not even the people who work for me. I've kept it hidden for so long, for fear of what it would mean if they found out." The words hung in the air, but Celine couldn't move, couldn't process what he was saying. She had known something was wrong. She had felt it in the distance between them, in the way he had withdrawn, in the way his health had seemed to decline so suddenly. But hearing it from his lips, hearing him admit it, felt like a blow to the chest. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Vincent's eyes were empty, distant. "It's a disease," he said, his tone flat. "One that's irreversible. It's been progressing for years, but I didn't want anyone to know. I thought I could control it, keep it hidden. But I can't. Not anymore." Celine's mind raced. She didn't understand. The man she had married, the man who had been so distant, so aloof, was sick. What did that mean for her? What did that mean for their future? "I didn't want you to know this," Vincent continued, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "I didn't want you to see me like this, but I needed you to understand. I needed you to know that I sought you out for more than just your youth, your beauty. I needed you because of your health, because of what you can offer." Celine's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" Vincent's gaze didn't waver. "I wanted you because you're strong, you're healthy, you're everything I'm not anymore. I've watched my body deteriorate, watched myself become someone I don't recognize. I needed someone who could take my wealth, my legacy, someone who could carry on what I've built when I'm gone." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about a future together. It was about money. It was about power. About her youth and her health being the only things that mattered. Vincent leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "I didn't want to be a burden, Celine. I thought I could hide it, live in the shadows, but I can't anymore. I can't pretend that this isn't happening, and I can't pretend that this marriage isn't part of the plan to secure everything I've worked for, to make sure that when I'm gone, it doesn't all fall apart." Celine felt dizzy. The world around her seemed to tilt, everything she thought she knew about this man, about their life together, crumbling before her eyes. This wasn't what she had signed up for. This wasn't the life she had imagined. "But you didn't tell me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You didn't tell me any of this. You didn't give me a choice." Vincent's eyes softened for a brief moment, but there was no apology in his gaze, no remorse. "I didn't want to burden you with this. I wanted you to choose me freely, without knowing what was coming." Celine stood there, the room spinning around her. The truth was more than she could bear. She had been chosen for her health, for the promise of what she could offer, not for who she was. The silence between them stretched out, heavy and thick. The man she had married wasn't who she thought he was. The mask, the distance, the coldness, it wasn't just a personality trait. It was a defense mechanism. He had been hiding from the world, from her, from everything. And now, everything was laid bare. "Is this all about money?" Celine asked, her voice a hollow echo of what it had been before. "Is this why you wanted me, because of what I could give you?" Vincent didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if he was waiting for her to understand. And in that moment, Celine realized that the mask wasn't just to hide his face. It was to hide everything, the truth, the vulnerability, the fear. "I need you, Celine," Vincent said quietly, his voice breaking. "I need you to help me finish this. I need you to carry what I can't anymore. You're the only one who can." The weight of his words hit her all at once. The future she had agreed to, the marriage, the life, it had all been about survival, about securing a future that didn't belong to her. Celine stood there, her chest tight with emotion, her mind reeling. The man she had married wasn't the man she had thought he was, but the truth was, she wasn't sure who she was anymore either. She had married for security, for a promise of something better, but now she had to ask herself, what was it worth? The mask on the desk seemed to mock her, its smooth surface hiding everything Vincent had kept inside. And as she stared at it, she wondered if there was more to this than just money. More to him, more to her future. But for now, all she knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The study was dim, the shadows stretching long as the evening settled in. The soft glow of the lamp beside them flickered, casting a warm light on Vincent's face, but it couldn't dispel the coldness in his eyes. Celine sat across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. The air between them was thick, laden with secrets, with truths that had been buried for too long. And now, he was laying it all bare. Vincent sat motionless, his hands folded tightly in his lap, the mask resting on the table between them like a silent witness. The same mask he had worn during their wedding, the same mask that had come to symbolize everything about him, his distance, his secrecy, his detachment. And now, it was the key to the confession that was spilling from his lips. "I didn't just wear the mask because of my illness," he said, his voice strained, the weight of the words heavy in the room. "I wore it because of her." Celine's heart skipped a beat. Her. The word lingered in the air like a ghost. She had never heard him speak of anyone else. She had never heard him speak of love. Vincent's eyes darkened as he continued, his gaze fixed on the mask in front of him. "I loved her deeply, Celine. I thought I would marry her. We had dreams, plans, but then she was taken from me. And when she died, a part of me died too. I swore I would never be seen the same way again. I swore I would never let anyone see my face. Not the way it looked now, not the way it felt to lose everything." Celine's breath caught in her throat. Taken from him. The words echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she saw Vincent not as the cold, distant man she had married, but as someone who had been broken by loss. Someone who had built walls around himself to keep from feeling the pain of what he had lost. "That's when I started wearing the mask," Vincent continued, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "It wasn't just to hide my sickness, it was to hide everything, to protect myself from the world, to protect myself from feeling anything ever again." Celine sat still, her heart torn between pity and anger. She understood loss, the way it could shape a person, but this felt like something else. She had married him, yes, but she had never expected this. She had never expected him to offer his heart, however broken, in the way he was now. And yet, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his words, the weight of a man who had loved and lost and was now clinging to whatever shred of control he could find. "So, the mask," she began, her voice trembling, "it was never just about your condition, was it?" Vincent's gaze flicked to her, his eyes heavy with something that resembled regret. "No," he whispered, the truth between them raw and painful. "It was never just about that. It was about hiding from the world, hiding from myself, hiding from the person I used to be." Celine couldn't speak for a moment. She didn't know what to say. She had come here expecting to hear the truth, but hearing it this way, hearing it from someone who had been hiding so much for so long, felt like a blow to the chest. She had thought she understood Vincent. She had thought she knew what she had married into. But now, all she had were more questions. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" Vincent closed his eyes, his face tightening with something shame, perhaps. "I didn't want you to pity me. I didn't want you to see me as a broken man. I wanted you to be with me because you chose to be, not because you felt sorry for me." His words hit her like a cold gust of wind. She had never thought of him that way, but now she could see it. The mask, the distance, the coldness, it had all been a defense, a way to shield himself from the world, from her. And yet, here they were, tangled in the aftermath of his decisions, of his pain. Vincent took a deep breath, and for the first time, Celine saw the weight of his decision hanging over him. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to search for something, something he couldn't find. "I'm asking you, Selene," he said softly, his voice almost pleading. "I'm asking you to stay, for a year, 1 year. I know it's not much, but it's what I can offer. After that, everything will be yours. The house, the wealth, everything I've worked for, it's all yours." Selene's mind raced, but she couldn't find the words to say. She had married him for his wealth, for the promise of security, but this felt different. There was a desperation in his voice, something raw, something that spoke to her own fears. She didn't know what to say to him, to the man who had offered everything he had left, but at what cost. Vincent reached out then, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on the table. "I know I've asked a lot of you. I know I've been distant, cold. But I'm offering you a choice, Selene. 1 year. After that, everything is yours. All you have to do is stay with me. And I promise you, the wealth, the future, it's all yours." Selene stared at his hand, the tremor in his fingers, and for the first time, she saw the mask for what it truly was. It wasn't just a physical thing. It was his shield, his way of protecting himself from the pain of his past, of his loss. And now, it was her turn to decide whether she would wear the mask, too. The room felt heavy with the weight of his words. Selene's heart raced, torn between the promise of everything she had ever dreamed of and the man who had given it to her, a man who had already given up so much. The choice was hers. The wealth, the security, everything she had wanted for her family. But the price was steep. The price was her soul, tied to Vincent, and the mask he had worn for so long. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking. Vincent didn't move, didn't try to comfort her. He just waited, his eyes searching hers, as if he were waiting for her to make the impossible decision. Selene felt the weight of it all, the weight of the bargain being offered. The future, her future, hung in the balance. Would she accept the deal? Would she live in the shadow of Vincent's pain, wearing his mask along with him? Or would she find another way to save her family, to live a life not bound by this man's desperate bargain? The silence between them grew, thick and suffocating. Selene knew she couldn't make this decision lightly. The price was too high, the future too uncertain. But the decision was hers. She had to decide, and whatever she chose, it would change everything. For both of them, the days that followed Vincent's offer were a blur, a fog of confusion and uncertainty that clouded Selene's every thought. The mansion, with its cold, stone walls and long, empty hallways, seemed to close in on her as she wandered through it, searching for something, for meaning, for answers, for a sign that would tell her what to do. But there was nothing. No answers. No clarity. The house was still. The silence was deafening. And yet, Selene felt it, the weight of Vincent's request, the weight of everything he had shared with her, pressing down on her with every passing moment. He had been so open with her, so vulnerable, and that made her feel both closer to him and further apart. The more she learned about his past, the more she saw the man behind the mask, and the more she realized just how deeply he had been affected by his loss. But the more she understood his pain, the more she saw his vulnerability, the more her own feelings began to shift in ways she hadn't expected. There was a part of her that began to pity him. That began to feel sorry for the man who had lost so much, who had built his life on a foundation of hurt and fear. She saw the way he trembled when he spoke of his past, the way his hands shook when he reached for his wine glass, as if the very act of holding something in his hands was a reminder of how fragile he had become. And yet there was another part of her, a part that couldn't ignore the resentment building inside her. He had made this choice, had chosen to wear the mask, had chosen to hide from the world. And now he was asking her to bear the weight of his past, his sickness, his emotional burden. He was offering her everything he had, but in exchange, he was asking for her soul, for her youth, for her life. It was too much for her to carry. But the allure of the wealth he was offering, the security, the luxury, the life she had always dreamed of, was hard to ignore. It tugged at her, pulling her in with the promise of a future without struggle, without the fear that had always gnawed at her family's every move. The life she could have, the life that Vincent could give her, was everything she had ever wanted. All she had to do was accept his bargain. But at what cost? Selene sat by the window one evening, the faint light of the setting sun casting a soft glow across the room. The sky outside was painted with shades of orange and pink, but inside, the air felt heavy. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock, the soft hum of the house, and she realized that she had been waiting. waiting for something to change, for someone to tell her what to do. Her thoughts kept returning to Vincent, to the way he had looked at her when he made his offer. There had been something in his eyes, something broken but desperate, as though he had given her the world and now all he could do was wait for her to take it. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet the storm inside her, but it was impossible. The desire for security, for a future without fear, clashed with the obligation she felt toward Vincent. He had shared his pain with her, and in some strange way, she felt connected to him. But she couldn't ignore the resentment that was building inside her, resentment for the way he had used his past, his sickness, as a way to control her. She had come here to marry him for the promise of a better life, but now, she realized, the choice was no longer just about money. It was about the kind of person she would become if she stayed. The guilt she felt was suffocating. If she said no, if she walked away from this bargain, she would lose everything. She would lose the life she had dreamed of, the safety for her family. But if she said yes, if she stayed with Vincent for a year, if she took the wealth he offered, she would lose herself. She would lose the parts of her that still believed in something pure, something real. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in the quiet hum of the house, her heart torn in two. But when she opened her eyes, Vincent was standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his figure outlined by the dim light of the hallway. "Selling," he said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I know this isn't easy. I know I've asked more than I should. But you must understand, this is the only way I can protect you. This is the only way I can protect us." She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her heart heavy, her thoughts spinning. "You've given me everything," he continued, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "You've given me your youth, your life, and I can't ask for more than that, but I need you to understand that this is the only way I can offer you what I have." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Celine felt the weight of his desperation settle over her. She saw the way his eyes searched hers, the way his hands trembled at his sides, as if he was waiting for her to make a choice, the choice that would change everything. Celine stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She didn't know what to say, she didn't know what to do, but the more she looked at him, the more she felt something else stirring inside her. A part of her that wasn't just pity, wasn't just resentment, it was understanding. Understanding of the weight he carried, the pain he had hidden from the world. And for the first time, she saw him for what he truly was, not just the man who had offered her everything, but the man who had been broken by his own past, who had turned to her in desperation. "I don't know if I can do this, Vincent," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can carry this." He stepped toward her, his face softening for the first time since they had spoken. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on her arm. "You don't have to carry it alone," he said softly. "I'll be here, I'll be with you." Celine closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't know if she could do this. She didn't know if she could accept this life, this bargain, this man. But as she opened her eyes and looked into his, something shifted inside her. The line between obligation and desire had blurred, and she didn't know where it would lead. But the choice was hers. And the truth was, no matter what she decided, she would never be the same again. The days seemed to stretch on, each one blending into the next, as Celine navigated her life in the house that never felt like home. Vincent had become a constant presence in her world, but the distance between them remained, always defined by the mask he refused to remove. It was as if that mask held not only his illness, but the key to the man he used to be, a man she was still struggling to understand. Each night, Celine found herself staring at Vincent as he sat at the head of the long table, his gaze distant, always distant. The mask never left him, even during their quiet dinners, even when they sat in the study, the only time they shared any kind of conversation. It was always there, perched on the edge of his face like a shield, a barrier between them. A reminder of what he had been, of what he couldn't let go of. But the more she observed him, the more she noticed things she hadn't before, the small tremors in his hands, the way his shoulders sagged when he thought no one was looking, the weight of his silence. At first, she had only seen the man behind the mask as a figure to be feared, a man who had hidden his past and his sickness from her. But now, as the weeks passed, she began to see the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability that peeked through when he thought no one was watching. There were moments, fleeting, brief, when Vincent's eyes would soften, when he would drop the cold, distant gaze and look at her like she mattered. But those moments were few, and when they came, they only left her more confused, more unsure of what to make of this man. Was she just another part of his plan? Another pawn in his game of survival, meant to secure his legacy when he could no longer carry it? Or was there something real between them, something more than the agreement that had bound them from the start? One evening, as dusk settled over the estate, Celine found herself wandering the grounds, drawn by something she couldn't explain. The garden was quiet, the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers heavy in the air. The darkening sky above seemed to swallow everything, turning the world into something soft and muted. She walked deeper into the garden, her footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel path. And then she saw him. Vincent was sitting by the old stone fountain, his hands resting on the stone, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. For a moment, he didn't notice her. His posture was slouched, the weight of his body sinking into the bench. The mask was beside him, discarded for the moment, as though he had let it fall away in this private space, this quiet moment away from the world. Celine hesitated, her breath caught in her chest. She had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so stripped of the distance that usually defined him. She took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to approach him. "Vincent," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, his eyes searching her face for a moment before he looked down at the mask beside him, his fingers brushing the surface of it like it was something sacred, something he couldn't bear to leave behind. "I didn't expect you," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. There was something raw in his tone, something that made Celine's chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, her gaze dropping to the mask beside him. "Why don't you take it off, just for once?" Vincent's eyes flickered to the mask, his expression hardening. "I can't," he said, the words laced with finality. "I'm not who you think I am, and this," he gestured to the mask, then to his face, his voice cracking slightly. "This is all I have left. The mask is all that keeps me together." Celine felt the weight of his words press down on her, but she couldn't stop herself from stepping closer, her eyes searching his face. "You don't have to hide from me," she said softly, her voice more certain than she felt. Vincent's lips parted as if he was going to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he lowered his gaze to the mask, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up and held it to his chest. Celine took another step forward, her heart racing. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why can't you let anyone see you? Why can't you let me in?" For the first time, she saw him flinch, his hand clutching the mask so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "I'm not the man I used to be," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And I can't let anyone see me like this. I can't let you see me like this." She stepped closer, her hand reaching out instinctively, resting gently on his arm. "I'm not afraid of you, Vincent," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not afraid of what's under the mask." He lifted his gaze to hers, his eyes dark and searching. The pain in his expression was so raw that it took Celine's breath away. For a moment, he looked like the man he used to be, someone she could have known, someone who had been lost long ago. "I don't know if you can ever truly see me," Vincent said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can let you. I don't know if I can let anyone in again." The silence stretched between them, and Celine felt the weight of his words settle around her. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to bridge the gap between the man she had married and the man who had been hiding behind the mask for so long. But there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability, a fragility that she hadn't seen before. And for the first time, she wondered if she was falling for a man she didn't truly know. A man who was hiding from the world, from his past, from himself. A man who was broken, but still desperately clinging to the remnants of the life he had once known. "Vincent," she said softly, her voice breaking through the silence, "you don't have to do this alone." He didn't respond, his gaze dropping back to the mask in his hands, his fingers brushing over the surface as if he could find something in it that would fix him. Celine took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she didn't know how to make. She had promised to be here, to stay, but as the days passed, the line between obligation and desire had begun to blur. She didn't know what was real anymore, the man she had married, the man she was beginning to understand, or the man she could never fully reach. But in that moment, as she stood there beside him, she realized something. She wasn't just falling for a man who wore a mask, she was falling for the man behind it. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous thing of all. The estate was eerily quiet that evening, the kind of silence that pressed into Celine's chest with a weight that she couldn't shake. The air in the house was thick, filled with anticipation of something she couldn't yet name. Vincent had been distant all day, more so than usual. His movements had been erratic, his eyes more clouded than they had been in weeks, and Celine could feel the tension building between them. It was as though something was coming, something that would break the fragile calm they had been living in. She had spent the afternoon packing the halls, her thoughts turning over the same questions, the same doubts. She had asked herself time and again if she truly knew Vincent, if the man she had married was the one she thought he was. The mask had been his shield, his barrier from the world, but it had also become a barrier between them. She knew there was more to him, more to his past, and as the days passed, the distance between them seemed to grow. The mask, the secrecy, the distance, it had all started to feel like a lie she couldn't keep living. But tonight, everything would change. There was a knock at the door, sharp and loud, echoing through the empty house. Celine's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound, a sense of unease crawling up her spine. She had not been expecting visitors, and Vincent had not mentioned anything about a guest. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her was an older man, his sharp eyes filled with recognition as he looked down at her. His face was familiar, though she couldn't place it, and the moment he saw her, his gaze softened with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. "Celine," the man said, his voice low but warm, almost as if he had been expecting her all along. "I'm sorry to intrude. I'm Jonathan. I knew Vincent long before you did." The name hit her like a cold wind. Jonathan, a name she had never heard before, but one that now felt like an omen. "Come in," she said, her voice shaky, almost afraid of what was coming next. She stepped aside as Jonathan entered, his eyes scanning the room before he spoke again. "I've been trying to reach Vincent for some time," Jonathan said, his gaze drifting to the staircase. "But I don't think he's ready for what I've come to say." Celine felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the back of a chair as if unsure where to sit. "Vincent hasn't been entirely honest with you, Celine, about who he really is, about his past. I don't know if he's ever been able to tell you what happened. But now, I think it's time you knew." Celine's stomach tightened. What was he talking about? What had Vincent not told her? She had always suspected there was more to him than the man she had married, but now, hearing Jonathan speak, she felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away. Jonathan looked at her, his eyes softening. "Vincent lost someone he loved a long time ago," he began. "A woman, and when she died, he was shattered. He swore to never let anyone in again, to never let anyone get close. But the guilt, it never left him. And the mask wasn't just to hide his illness. It was to hide the pain, the guilt, the regret that has haunted him for years." Celine felt a knot form in her throat. She glanced toward the stairs, toward the study where Vincent had been earlier, and felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. "Vincent never told you this, did he?" Jonathan continued. "About his former life, about the woman he lost. He's kept it hidden for so long, kept it buried deep inside of him, but it's eating him alive. The mask is a symbol of that, of the vow he made to never be seen again, of the man he thought he had become, a man who couldn't love anymore." Celine's heart raced. But I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "If that's true, then why did he marry me? Why did he ask for my help?" Jonathan's eyes softened even more, as if he were pitying her. "He didn't marry you for love, Celine. He married you because he needed someone to save him. He needed someone who could carry his weight, someone who could give him a reason to keep going, even when he couldn't bear to face himself." Celine's mind reeled. So this was the truth? She had been chosen not because of who she was, but because of what she could offer, her youth, her health, the promise of something he could never have again. She had never been more than a replacement, never more than a means to an end. She looked at Jonathan, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "What does that mean for me?" Jonathan's eyes were full of sorrow, but his words were heavy. It means you've been a part of his scheme, just like everyone else, and it means that he has never truly loved you, not the way you deserve. The words struck Celine like a blow to the chest. She felt the room spinning around her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Vincent had never truly loved her. The man she had married, the man she had given herself to, had never loved her. Before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Vincent appeared in the doorway, his eyes locking with hers. He looked pale, his face gaunt as always, but there was something different about him now. His expression was hard, almost defensive, as if he had known this moment was coming, but wasn't prepared to face it. "What is he telling you, Celine?" Vincent's voice was low, his gaze never leaving Jonathan. There was a tremor in his hands as he stood there, the weight of his guilt more obvious than ever. Celine stood frozen, her thoughts racing. She looked at Vincent, at the man she had married, and for the first time she saw him clearly. The mask was not just a physical thing. It was a symbol of everything he had kept hidden, a symbol of the man who had promised her everything but had never truly given her his heart. Vincent stepped into the room, his eyes shifting to Celine, and for the first time she saw the brokenness in them. The weight of years of guilt, of grief, of a man who had never allowed himself to love again. "I never meant for you to be a part of this, Celine," Vincent said, his voice strained, almost desperate. "But I needed you. I needed you to help me finish what I started. This was never about love. It was about survival." Celine's heart shattered. The truth was ugly, cold, and it sank into her like ice. She had never been enough for Vincent. She had only ever been the tool, the lifeline. And in that moment, the man she had married was a stranger to her. The love she had hoped for, the connection she had wanted, had never truly existed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Celine asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you hide this from me?" Vincent didn't answer. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had no excuses left. There was no more mask to hide behind. Celine turned away from him, her heart aching with the weight of what she had just learned. She had married a man who had never truly loved her. A man who had used her to fill the emptiness inside him. And now, the question was clear. Could she accept the truth about the man she had married? Or was she already too far gone, too entangled in the web of lies he had spun? Celine didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain: everything had changed. The house felt quieter than usual, the silence hanging heavy in the air. Celine walked slowly down the hallway, her footsteps muted against the marble floor. The house had become a labyrinth, its once familiar spaces now alien to her. She had spent so many days trying to convince herself that she could live with the man behind the mask, that she could somehow reconcile her dreams with the life he had offered her. But now, after everything she had learned, after the truth that had unraveled before her, she knew she could no longer pretend. Vincent's study was the same as it had always been, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the shelves, the heavy air thick with the scent of old leather and dust. But tonight, everything felt different. Tonight, it felt like the final act. Vincent sat at the desk, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze distant. He was waiting for her, but not in the way he had waited before. This time, there was no coldness, no detachment. There was only a quiet resignation in the way he sat, as if he already knew what was coming, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Celine stood in the doorway, her heart heavy, her mind racing. She had never imagined this day would come. She had never imagined that the man she had married, the man she had believed in, would be someone she could no longer recognize. And yet, here she was, on the precipice of a decision that would change everything. Vincent didn't speak, he didn't need to. His eyes were fixed on her, searching, waiting. Celine walked toward him slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the mask on the desk. It sat there, as it always had, a symbol of everything Vincent had hidden from her. It was smooth, cold to the touch, the intricate details of its design glinting in the dim light. It was beautiful in a way, but it had become more than just a mask. It had become a barrier between them, between the man she had married and the man he truly was. "Vincent," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know if she could say anything else. She didn't know if the words were enough to convey everything that had built up inside her. "I can't live with this any longer." He didn't answer, he didn't move. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, that made her heart ache. He knew this was coming. and in some strange way, Celine realized he had been waiting for it. With a deep breath, she lifted the mask from the desk, the weight of it pressing down on her. She held it in her hands for a moment, the cool surface cold against her palms. She didn't know why she had been so afraid to remove it before. Maybe it was because she didn't want to face the truth. Maybe it was because she had been afraid of what she would see, of what it would mean for her. But now, as she stood before him, she knew what she had to do. Slowly, deliberately, she brought the mask up to his face, her hands shaking as she adjusted it. For the first time, she saw Vincent's eyes soften, a flicker of something passing across his face, regret, fear, or something deeper, something she couldn't place. And then, in one swift motion, Celine lifted the mask from his face. For the first time, she saw him, really saw him. His face was gaunt, pale, and the lines of age and illness were more pronounced than she had ever imagined. But there was something else, something beneath the surface, that she hadn't expected to see. His eyes, though tired and worn, held a depth that she hadn't recognized before. There was pain in them, yes, but there was also something softer. A vulnerability that he had kept hidden for so long. She stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. This was the man she had married, the man behind the mask. But he was not the man she had thought he would be. He was not the man she had imagined when she had agreed to this marriage. And yet, in that moment, as she looked into his eyes, Celine realized something. She had been looking at him for so long, but she hadn't been seeing him. Not truly. She had been seeing only what she wanted to see, only what she had convinced herself was real. But now, with the mask removed, she saw him for who he truly was, broken, fragile, and human. Vincent didn't speak. His eyes searched hers, and for the first time there was no distance between them. There was no mask. There was only the truth, raw and unspoken. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his hands trembling as they reached for her. "I never meant for you to see this, to see me." Celine felt a wave of emotion crash over her, a mixture of pity, anger, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. She had come here looking for answers, looking for the man she had married, but what she had found was not what she expected. The mask had been his shield, his way of hiding from the world from her. But now, with it gone, they were both exposed. And for the first time, Celine realized how much she had been hiding from herself. "I don't know what to do with this," she said softly, her voice trembling as she stood there, the weight of the truth settling over her like a heavy fog. "I don't know what to do with you." Vincent's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, Celine thought he might crumble under the weight of his own guilt. But then, slowly, he looked back up at her, his eyes filled with something softer now, resignation, perhaps, or acceptance. "The mask was never just for the world," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "It was for me, too. I needed it to survive, but now I can't keep hiding, I can't keep pretending." Celine swallowed, her heart aching with the weight of his words. The mask was gone, but the truth remained. They were both standing in the ruins of what had once been a dream, and she didn't know what would come next. But in that moment, as she looked at Vincent, she knew one thing for sure: the man she had married was not the man she thought he was. And as the mask was removed, they were both left standing there, exposed, vulnerable, and unsure of what the future would hold. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick. The mask was no longer needed, but the question remained: what would happen when all that was left was raw truth? And for the first time, Celine realized that perhaps this was the moment they had both been waiting for, the moment when they could stop hiding, stop pretending, and finally face whatever came next together.